Welcome to the Prospective Doctor Podcast, where we will provide essential information for pre-medical students and those already in medical school. Listen each week for tips on how to improve your application and gain an acceptance to medical school.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining me today. Today I wanted to talk about interviews, and specifically the MMI interview. The MMI, for those that don't know, stands for multiple mini interview. So about 50% of medical schools are using the MMI interview instead of the traditional type interview, which is the common one where, you sit down with a faculty member or another student and they ask you questions like, why do you want to be a doctor? Why do you want to come to this school? The MMI interview is quite different. So with the MMI interview, what it is composed of usually several stations, usually somewhere between 5 to 8 stations, depending on the school. And at each station, you're given a different scenario. And these scenarios can be an ethical scenario. They can be a role-playing scenario. They can be a scenario where you just discuss an issue. And basically what you do is you get a little bit of time, usually 1 or 2 minutes, to review that scenario. And then you go into the room and you talk to a rater in there who's just sitting there, and their whole job is to grade your response. Sometimes they do have follow-up questions and sometimes they don't. And usually those responses are somewhere between 5 to 8 minutes, again, depending on the school. So I wanted to talk a little bit about each of those different types of scenarios today to give you an idea of what to expect and how to prepare. So I usually, when I prep people for interviews, is I try to break it down into the different types of scenarios you may encounter. So first, let's talk about some ethical scenarios. So when I think of ethical scenarios, I see a lot of scenarios revolving around decision-making when it comes to a patient and how you would handle that decision-making as a physician. So some scenarios that I see are an old woman is on life support and the husband wants to end the life support. What do you do as a physician? You have one liver to give to a patient who needs a liver transplant. You have a 20-year-old woman and a 70-year-old man. How do you decide? Somebody is refusing treatment at the hospital for an illness, and you're the physician and you're supposed to talk to that patient. So all of these are kind of ethical scenarios where you're forced to make a decision and navigate a situation that you may not be altogether familiar with. So let's talk about the general approach on how to handle these. There isn't really a cookie cutter way to handle MMI situations, but my approach and what I've seen that works the best is to first demonstrate understanding for the situation. So let's take the example of the elderly woman on life support and the husband wants to withdraw life support. So I think it's important to start off and say something to the extent of, I understand that this is a very difficult situation and there's a lot of decision making that has to occur. And as the physician, I would really take into account the family's emotional state and the difficulty and gravity of this situation. So I think that's really important with these ethical situations, is really just acknowledging that it's difficult and showing empathy and concern for the people at hand that are forced with making these difficult decisions. Next, I think one of the greatest tools you can have in these ethical situations, and I see almost every situation where you can ask for more information. So I think after you acknowledge it, you could say something to the extent of, next, I would want to sit down with the family and talk to them about this decision making. And first, I would like to know more about why they want to make this particular decision. So I think that this is a really common thing that you can do in almost all of these ethical situations. Ask why. And what I mean by that is, we have common assumptions, right? In this type of situation where the husband wants to withdraw life support, our assumption most likely is that he wants to end the patient's life. But maybe there's more to it that we just don't know. So asking him why and trying to get his motivations can tell you more as a physician and a decision maker. So for example, what if he actually just did not understand that she was completely on life support and that if withdrawing it would be her demise, that she would pass away? Although this maybe seems trivial, or maybe it seems that he should have this understanding, some people don't have this understanding when they're faced with tough decisions. The next thing you could think about for situations like this is maybe he doesn't understand the gravity of her situation. Maybe he doesn't understand that she has terminal illness. Maybe he can't afford to keep her on life support. So I think that there are lots of things that you can find out about by asking why and asking for more information. However, just keep in mind that most of these situations or these scenarios are you just kind of talking about it. So don't expect the rater to necessarily give you additional information. So it would be more something going like, you would say something more like this. First, I would try to ask him why and try to ascertain more information on why he wants to make this decision. For instance, maybe he doesn't understand what it actually means to remove her from life support, or maybe he doesn't understand the full extent of her illness, or maybe he can't afford to keep her on life support. I could imagine there are lots of different reasons why he is making this decision, and so I would like to know more about them so that I could counsel him appropriately. So that would be what your answer would be, something like that, where you're just kind of more talking theoretically and not really waiting for a response or an answer from the rater. So that leads you to the next thing is, now that you know a little bit more information about the situation and the decision making of the husband, you can try to help resolve or help him understand different aspects of that. So then you could say something to the extent of, after I understood why he wants to make this decision, I would try to help him through it. So if he didn't fully understand how ill she was, I would make sure to talk to him about her illness and make sure that he demonstrates understanding after we discuss it, that she is very ill and that life support is the only thing holding her on. After that, I would try to discuss other barriers that may be hindering him from making the decision. For instance, if he wasn't able to afford keeping her on life support and he wanted to keep her on life support, then maybe I would talk to other people in the hospital, like social work, in order to find funds to keep her on life support. So you can kind of address those issues, again, theoretically, but address them and talk about how you could help. Next, I think the best thing to do is to really just verbalize that you would sit down and just try to make a decision and be a support system for the family and for the husband, and just help them through making whatever decision they decide to make. So you can verbalize that by saying something to the extent of, after I explained to him all of the procedures and her illness and utilized any avenues I could to help him make the decision, I would just want him to take some time to think about it, talk with the rest of his family, and I would try to support him and help him through whatever decision he does need to make in the end. I would also try to figure out the patient's wishes, if possible. Perhaps she had an advance directive or a will, or had verbalized her wishes if she was ever in a state like this, and I would try to honor those as well as her husband's, and at least find a common ground where we can make a decision based on his wishes and hers. Ultimately, if we were all unable to come to a consensus, I would probably consult the ethics committee or a supervisor in the hospital to help me. So in that little piece that I just demonstrated, you're really just showing understanding again, and you're really trying to come together as one unit, being supportive as possible to help make a decision with this family. And the other thing, which I think is critical in these ethical type situations, is it's always okay to ask for help. So they're not expecting you to know every single answer or know the legal obligations of someone trying to make a surrogate decision for another person. That's not what these questions are for. They're asking, and these questions are trying to just see how you make decisions, how you process information, and how you can display your empathy to patients in difficult situations. So it's okay to ask for help. So In hospitals and most medical centers, they have something called an ethics committee, which is just different faculty and nurses and physicians and ancillary staff that come together to help assist physicians and family in difficult situations such as these. So this ethics committee can review the case, can talk to the family, in addition, can recruit additional resources to help make a decision and help process all of this. So it's okay to ask for help. If you don't think of the ethics committee, you can say, I would ask for help from a colleague or a supervisor or someone else in the department. And that's totally fine to do in these scenarios. And also, medicine isn't just a one-person job. You will get help from other people. So again, it's demonstrating that you're willing to work as a team and really willing to do what's best for the patient. So that's a little bit about these ethical decision-making scenarios. Next, I wanted to talk about scenarios related to policy or scenarios that are related to more critical thinking skills. So for these, I think of situations where you need to discuss the pros and cons of abortion or stem cell research or patient confidentiality, or maybe they're just going to ask you something to the extent of talking about the pros and cons of medical marijuana, or if putting you into a specific situation where you'd have to critically think through it. So if you were in charge of a healthcare facility, do you have an obligation as a physician to report infectious disease to the CDC? Or do you think medicine should be more about changing behavior to prevent disease or treating existing diseases? So these are all kind of fall into the category of just a scenario that you really have to just think through it and discuss it. Again, there's no cookie cutter way to answer these types of scenarios, but I really suggest when you get the scenario outside of the room, take some time just to think about it and try to really identify all the issues in the scenario. So for example, let's talk about the question of, do you think general practitioners have an obligation to report their patient's health status to a public health agency if their patients have an active infectious disease? So when I read a question like this, I'm trying to dissect all the different issues here. I see that there's an issue about reporting, and this can affect patient confidentiality and patient privacy. Then I see that there is an obligation of general practitioners to report their patients' health if they have an active infectious disease. That makes me think of the health of others and the health of the community. So what is the physician's obligation here? So try to identify all of the different aspects when you're going to approach the question. And then when you go into the room to talk about them, I try to recommend having a logical structure to the question, and maybe even start out by kind of outlining what you're planning to say. For example, you could go in there and say, from what I understand, this question is asking if physicians have an obligation to report an infectious disease to a public health agency. I understand that this is a difficult question and this can be a difficult scenario. And really, the two issues at hand here are about patient confidentiality and not breaking that if a physician does report that to a public health agency. And the other big issue is if a physician does not report the patient's condition, then that can affect public health and maybe put other people in danger. So if you lay out a little outline like that, it kind of helps the rater see where you're going with your thoughts. And I think it helps you keep a logical order to your thoughts too, as then when you go and talk about them. And then I think the next part is really just to discuss each of those issues. So talk about the pros and cons of not reporting the disease and talk about the pros and cons of reporting the disease. And ultimately in the question, if the question asks you to make a decision, so do you think, you should make a decision. If it's a question that just says, discuss the pros and cons of abortion, you don't necessarily need to take a stance on this. You can just kind of discuss the pros and cons, which is what it's asking you. And I suggest not trying to take a big stance on these ones that just say discuss, because you can kind of evoke some emotional response in the rater, and it's not necessary. But if a question like this says, do you think, or what would you do in this situation, you should pick a side, and stand by it with your answer. Finally, we'll take a couple minutes just to talk about role-playing scenarios. So I think role-playing scenarios are a little bit of fun, but they are difficult for a lot of people to practice. So some of the role-playing scenarios that I've seen are you're a third-year medical student and one of your fellow medical students shows up to rounds drunk, and so you go and approach him about him showing up to rounds drunk. I've seen other ones where you see a patient and they're asking you for prescription painkillers and you see no reason why they have a need for prescription painkillers. And so you have to approach the situation to ask them, why they want these prescription pain medicines and ascertain whether or not they need them. Or I've seen some where you just kind of have to go and talk to somebody that may be upset. And these role-playing scenarios are really reflective of scenarios that you will have as a physician. You're going to come across patients that don't agree with your treatment plan, or patients that are upset, or come across somebody that's not behaving appropriately. And so you need to address those people and know how to efficiently work with them. So I think in these types of questions, again, acknowledging the difficulty of the situation and kind of helping to understand is important. So let's take the example of the coworker or the co-medical student showing up drunk. You could say something to the extent of, hey, I noticed that you've been a little tired coming to work, and man, this has been a really tough rotation. I can definitely understand how exhausting it can be. And then I think after that, after you've kind of showed your compassion and concern, then you should try to have the patient or the person you're talking to open up to you. Instead of accusing them, saying something to the extent of, oh, I noticed you're drunk, try to have them open up to you and talk to you about what's going on. So you could say something to the extent of, yeah, I mean, you've just seemed really tired and, not really like your normal self. Can you tell me, is everything okay? Are you handling things okay? Are you working through these tough rotations okay? And then you kind of wait to see what the rater responds with. Some of them may be prompted to respond to you and say, yeah, you know what? I really haven't been doing okay, and I've been drinking a lot to help me through this. And that kind of gives you a lead in to talk about the drinking and the problem at hand. If they do not, they may say, oh no, I'm doing fine, which is usually the more common scenario. And at that point, I think you just need to kind of continue on your track. And ultimately, if they're not opening up to you, then I think it's time to be a little bit more blunt about it. So you could say something to the extent of, yeah, I'm so sorry. I noticed you're just not yourself. And a couple times I actually noticed that you it seemed that maybe you were drunk. Are you drinking? Are you having problems? And maybe this is a way that you're trying to, help yourself through it. So again, you're not being accusatory. You're trying to be supportive as possible, but then still trying to get to the root of the issue. My final note on these role-playing scenarios is always remember to do the right thing. Obviously, a coworker showing up drunk to treat patients can be something that can really put patients in danger and themselves in danger. So it's appropriate for you to verbalize that and say, I'm really concerned about yourself and I'm concerned about our patients that we're treating. So I think it's important to verbalize that. And then I think it's also very important to talk about how you can help that particular person. And if they do not get help, that you would take appropriate actions. And what I mean by that, if this person that's drinking is just refusing to stop drinking, then maybe you need to go and talk to one of the attending physicians or one of your faculty members about their behavior, because it can be so dangerous to himself and to patients. So you could say something to the extent of, yeah, I am really just worried about you and I'm worried about the care of our patients if you're drinking. I think it'd be really great for you to get some help. And if you're unable to get help by yourself or change your behavior, then I think that maybe we need to talk to the attending physician or to one of our faculty members to make sure that we're getting you the right help and getting you on the right track. So again, you're not being accusatory. You're not trying to make them ashamed or completely blame them for what's going on. You're just trying to show them you're supportive, but also that you're going to make the right decision and do the right thing in these scenarios. So I think that's really important to verbalize in these role-playing scenarios. Hopefully that helped kind of give you some direction on MMI prep. I know that all of these scenarios are slightly different, but usually they do have these common themes to them. And if you practice enough of them, you can start to pick out these themes and pick out what it is that you can work through and how you can use some of these tips for each of the scenarios that we talked about. Definitely think about using Med School Coach for prep for your MMI interviews. I think the best prep for MMI is just practice, practice, practice. So read through tons of scenarios, practice them with your family, your friends, rehearse them in front of the mirror, practice timing yourself so you know that you're giving enough response time. Lots of times when you're talking, it feels like you've been talking forever, but really it's only a couple minutes. And for these MMIs, you're expected to talk for about 5 to 8 minutes. So practice with timing yourself. And then I really think practicing with somebody that's gone through these scenarios and practiced them a ton of time is super helpful. So keep us in mind for that. I'll definitely be talking more about interviews later on. So catch us on the other podcast. Thanks for listening, guys. Bye.
Our mission is to inspire, encourage, and inform students as you journey through a rigorous and intricate process of achieving your dreams in medicine. Visit us at prospectivedoctor.com for more essential resources in your medical school journey.